This is my voiceover of the screen recording from Hippocampus on the nature of governments. So we're going to use the text version of Hippocampus, and I'm going to talk you through the nature of governments. So governments consist of the institutions that make and enact policies to govern people within a society or nation. That's your definition for government. And there are different forms of government that we're going to talk about during this short screencast. So when a government makes a policy, they're trying to fulfill several needs of society. The first one is to protect citizens from foreign threats. So you're going to organize armed forces and develop weapons and make alliances with other countries so you can protect your citizens from outside threats. Something that's similar to that is to maintain order, but that's internally in society by enforcing laws. So governments will make policies, but you have to have a power that's going to enforce them, and that's the second purpose of government, is to maintain order. So they're going to try to prevent crime and respond to emergency situations. We can also use the National Guard to do this, but usually it's the fire and police departments. The next function of government is to regulate the economy, and that's really important. One of the most important tools that the federal government has to regulate the economy is the Federal Reserve. And that's an agency of the U.S. government that sets interest rates. That's their primary tool that they can use. So if they want the economy to heat up, where people are buying more things, they'll lower interest rates so people can borrow money cheaper. If they want to slow down the economy, they'll raise interest rates so that people can't get access to consumer loans as easily, and they won't be able to buy as much. So that's how the government can control the economy through the Federal Reserve. The fourth function of government is to provide public goods and services, like schools, highways, and libraries. And typically public goods are available to everybody, not just the rich, but all U.S. citizens have access to those public goods and services. And it would be illegal to exclude those people. So whether you're rich or poor, you can get Medicare. If you need education loans, they should be available to everyone. And if you qualify for welfare, it should be available to everyone, regardless of their race, color, creed, ethnicity, whatever. The fifth function of government is to socialize the youth. And that seems like it's kind of brainwashing, but really it's just trying to help our young people understand how our democracy works. And as you're going to learn, it's important that we're educated about how our government works, otherwise democracy isn't very functional. And finally, the last function of government for our purposes is to raise taxes. You need to have money to operate your government. So everybody hates taxes. The old saying is, there's only two sure things in life, that's death and taxes. Taxes are a necessary evil because you have to have money to provide those public goods and services and to take care of your citizens. Okay, so in the nature of government, in order to have a government, you have to have something called a nation state. That's where a government can exist. There are four characteristics of a nation state. Those four characteristics are territory, population, sovereignty, and legitimate government. So first of all, you have to have a territory. You have to have borders. If you don't know where your country stops and starts, you have a problem. And it can be a really, really big country like Russia, or it can be a small country like actually the Vatican is considered a country. It's a tiny little part of Rome itself. So there's lots of different sizes. The next thing you can have is it has to be legitimate. You can have a territory, but if the government isn't seen as legitimate, it can't work, okay? So you have to have a legitimate government. The next thing that you have to have, or that's part of what comes with it, is a common culture. So you have to have some way of pulling people together, a shared identity. So if you think of Americans, we all kind of consider ourselves Americans, and you think about how we chant USA. That's kind of the thing that holds you together. So it's finding consensus among the population. And then finally, you need to have a sovereignty. So that's the ability to control your population and to make policies and to govern and not be controlled by outside forces. You have to be independent of other countries. That's called sovereignty. Okay? Okay, so in order to be considered legitimate, the population and other nations have to recognize its authority. So if you have a government that's operating and trying to operate, but the countries around it don't see that country or that government as legitimate, it can't operate. It'll be very, very difficult. So you can also oftentimes have illegitimate governments that are controlled by ruthless dictators and usually military officers that have taken over in like a coup or a revolution, and a lot of countries won't see them as legitimate. They'll operate, but usually out of fear. Now we're going to talk about the different kinds of government. Whether they're legitimate or not, there's different kinds. You can have a dictatorship where other countries don't recognize that leader, but they're in power, and they're not, even if you're not considered legitimate, they can still control the population. So we know about dictators like Hitler and Stalin and those evil rulers. So we're pretty familiar with dictators. It's one person. Just like dictators, though, is oligarchies. They operate just like dictatorships, but instead of just one person, you have a few people holding power. It's pretty unusual, but there are a few of them. Saddam Hussein was actually a dictator, but he had a small group of people around him, so it actually was an oligarchy. The next type of government is a monarchy. We don't see very many of them around anymore because a monarchy is a country that's ruled by a king or a queen and they think they get their power from God. So it's pretty unusual. It's divine rights. There are no more monarchs, true monarchies in the world anymore. Most of them are a different form of government called representative monarchies. And those are monarchies that that have a king or a queen, but they're just figureheads. They're just symbols. And the real control and policy-making ability rests with the parliament or some kind of elected representation. And the final form of government we're going to talk about is democracy. And now we're going to talk about some of the differences in those types of democracies, but sticking mostly to the big picture thing is we have direct democracies and we have indirect democracies. A direct democracy is the purest form of government, purest form of democracy in that all people get to vote on everything. You're only going to see direct democracies in very small communities because they're not going to they're small enough to be able to make the laws. You get too big, and even in medium-sized towns, and trying to make every single rule and law and have a vote on them by the people who live in that town is pretty awkward. So that you start to elect town councils, city councils to make those decisions. Now that turns into an indirect democracy, where people elect representatives to run the government. Most forms of government in democracy are indirect, where you elect someone to represent you in government, whether it's local government, state government, or federal government. Some state governments are a medium level. In other words, you're going to have state governments that, like Minnesota, for example, that have state laws and state policies, but our state participates and belongs to the national government, which is called the republic. In other words, the power rests with the elected officials rather than the people. But there's levels, there's state, and then there's national. So I hope that helps you prepare for your activity and assignments for Unit 1.